Good morning, everyone. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is a very special guest. We haven't had him on a while, and a lot has been going on in the world of organized labor and business here in the United States. With me is Charles Daniels of Putting Workers First. He also is involved in a number of projects such as the radio program Labor Vision, as well as also is active with the Communication Workers of America. Charles, take it from here. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. And feel free to elaborate on your credentials and professional affiliations, please.
Yeah, hey brother, it's great to be here. Always a joy to get to talk to you. The main thing that I would tell folks about is putting workers first, where it's just about improving the lives of workers everywhere, just focusing on labor-related issues, because I feel like when workers succeed, the entire country prospers, and there's a good balance between power, and that's really what we need. And as far as the Labor Vision podcast, we've slowed down a little bit on that. My co-host Jimmy Dennis needed to take a break, so we're still working it through. It's the official podcast of the Michigan AFL-CIO, so I'm working with them to figure out where it's going to go. And as far as CWA, I'm a 23-year member of the organization, and I'm just happy to be involved in the labor movement.
Well, so am I. And for those of you who don't know in the audience, just putting my phone on silent. Those of you who don't know already, I am also a member of my union, which is the Government Supervisors Association, which is ultimately also affiliated with Florida AFL-CIO. I'm the library branch manager, so my position is unionized, so we can choose to join the union or not, since Florida is a right-to-work state. I am a proud member of my union because also I believe that unions, when properly led, are actually stabilize capitalism and ease out the contradictions of capitalism, like what we had talked about with our previous guest, Trevor Loudon, who is an expert on communism and more on the right. A lot has been going on in the world of organized labor these past 6 months to a year. From the recent NRLB ruling, which kind of levels the playing field, to the recent waves of strikes, much more heavy, intense union organizing. Can you give us a summary first on what's going on in the world of strikes between UPS, Amazon, which has been going on for about 2 or 3 years, et cetera? Take it away, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's a lot to unpack, because there's been a ton of labor uprising where they're demanding more, especially on like the Teamster side, and they made it very clear that they were willing to walk out the door and do a long, sustained strike, and because of that, they got a really great contract, which I think has led to the UAW with Shawn Fain, their new president, really drawing a line in the sand with them in regards to their demands. Goodness, Nevin, I think they asked for a 40% raise, which is in line with what the CEOs have gotten on their raise. They're looking for a 4-day work week. They're looking to end the tiered system that they have over there. To put it in perspective, it almost felt like, to me, do you remember the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson from back in the day with William Wallace, where they're lined up and they're getting ready to have that huge battle with the English, and they come across and they're meeting in the middle, and the English are right, here's our demands for you to leave, and he cuts them off. He's like, no, man, here's my demands. You guys got to turn around, march this army out of here, stop at every house on the way back to England, apologize for 100 years of rape, murder, and oppression, and then also, by the way, your commander needs to cross this field, stick his head between his legs, and kiss his own ass. I feel like that's what Shawn Fain did. He just told him, like, straight up, we're ready to fight, and I'm curious to see how that plays out.
Yeah, very curious too as well. I mean, it's in its nascent stages right now. And of course, we have the hard-won victory of the UPS workers, where they received massive wage increases, air-conditioned UPS trucks. You want to comment about that too as well?
Just that it's a long time coming, right? That those workers right there have really been driving the economy for, like, literally driving the economy for a long time, and for decades that was a really good gig, being a driver. But over time, they've chipped away at a lot of what they have to where now it's there's so much oversight in regards to how long they can work, what they get paid for, do they get paid by the mileage right there. They're independent contractors, so they have to keep up their own trucks, and like a rubber band, it just stretched and stretched and stretched, so now it looks like it's starting to snap back. So I'm encouraged by that.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a little bit, talking about independent contractors, the issue of independent contractors, as well as also what's going on in the NRLB. I mean, I've been very strongly critical of the Biden administration from the right, from aspects of foreign policy, and also from a more pro-labor position for not doing enough. But there are certain aspects of labor policy that have been some victories. One of which aren't the NRLB. They, as we were talking just before on air, there was a big victory regarding the balance of labor management issues and the sort of management warping or abusing the labor union voting process. You want to tell us about that, please?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was gigantic. It was around 2 weeks ago, and I'd say it's one of the most labor friendly, influential rulings that they've had in the past half a century. It goes back to a case from 1949 called Joyce Silk, where they adopted some of the tenets of that case that were in place for a long time. And then around 1970, there was a Supreme Court ruling that knocked them out. Essentially, what it says is that when there is an organizational drive going on where they're leading up to an election and the company meddles in that election in an illegal way, right? Because these are laws we're talking about. It's not you shouldn't do this or you should do that. There are laws in place. When they break those laws and it results in a board charge where the board rules in favor of the union saying, yes, the company broke those laws, it no longer has to go to the election process. It goes directly to the bargaining. So it essentially forgoes the election process and they go right to bargaining a contract, which when you talk about the meddlement, the involvement, illegal activity done by companies in organizing drives, no, it's like through the roof. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it's a really high, alarming rate because there's no real negative penalties involved as far as fines, penalties, jail time, nothing like that for breaking labor laws. So for the longest time, companies have done it with impunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And they call it their hunting license, actually. So they view if they're fined, oh, well, who cares? The fines are even tax deductible, which to me is ridiculous, getting fines for conducting illegal activity. So this is a huge victory. And this is what makes me politically homeless. I'm a staunch critic of Biden, but if his administration happens to do the right thing on a particular issue, I'll say, look, job well done and everything else. Because again, I'm not bound to any political party. I like a lot of conservative goals, but I feel that there are institutions that unfortunately these days are tarred as progressive that actually help fulfill conservative goals. And before we go back to independent contractors, so a brief discussion of right to work and how Michigan overturned that. I know we discussed that a little bit in the last show, but we can kind of relish in our victory there. In your opinion, and especially because you've interacted with Republicans, with conservatives and whatnot, and people will say and express legitimate concerns about unions, the politics of aspects of their leadership, ideological goals, et cetera, et cetera. But what intelligent responses, and you're a very intelligent man, a seasoned activist, what do you tell conservatives, in your opinion, how do unions serve and actually fulfill conservative goals of strong nuclear families, stabilizing capitalism, encouraging entrepreneurship, which I know you support? If you didn't support that, I wouldn't have you on the show, with all due respect, no offense. How do they support that? You're a family man too, for those of you who also don't know in the audience. Charles is a family man with kids, married, etc. So take it away, Charles.
So to me, supporting unions is supporting the concept of America, what the founding fathers were looking at. They're democracies. They have constitutions. They have due process through the grievance procedure, right? There's nothing more American than a union. When you look at the preamble to the Constitution, we people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So all unions did was those workers coming together and saying that we're going to form a group inside of a group that has the same tenets and ideas that can help support the working people, because they quickly learned that if you left it up to the corporations, and I'm not like capitalist, social, all that stuff, I don't really care about that. But when it comes to the corporations, they have very distinct goals. And to me, they're kind of like sharks, right? All they're doing out there is they're gonna eat, they're gonna swim, and they're gonna make baby sharks. They don't care about anything else. They're a fish in a fish bowl, and they will eat until they explode. And it doesn't matter if they kill every piece of food there. They can't see the farther line, especially now where they've gotten rid of some of the regulations that they had in regards to stock buybacks, where if a company back in the day wanted to grow itself and increase and have longevity, they had to look forward and invest in human resources and invest in infrastructure and have innovation. But now they can create artificial scarcity just by buying back their own stock. And because they don't have the ability to be long, they're so myopic in how they view things, and it's the workers that suffer, right? That I hear all the time that the owners take all the risk and all that bullshit, and it pisses me off, because the most valuable thing, the only resource that we can't get back, is our time, right? So all these workers that are investing their time into something, and then a corporation goes belly up because they made stupid decisions, they all float away on their golden parachutes. The workers are the ones that get left holding the bag. And it pisses me off, because when these companies do go bankrupt and they default on all their debts, it's the taxpayers that pick up that money as well. So they created a system essentially where they can't lose. And I think unions do a good job of stabilizing the workforce, right? Because there has to be bargaining now between the company and the workers, because one worker trying to stand up to a corporation has zero chance. It's like that old proverb, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. When you have a union, they can't do that. There's more leverage on the worker side. And I think over the past 50 years, we've really tilted so far into being a corporatocracy more than anything else, that we have to go back the other way, because as income inequality levels continue to grow, there's only so far you can slide on barbed wire. Eventually, we're going to hit a big recession. And you could talk to people now that would argue that we're in a giant recession. We just don't know it, because we've become so good at managing recessions that it's almost to detriment. You've heard the analogy about the frog in the boiling water, right? Where you put him in there and it's cool, and you start to warm him up, and he'll just cook alive. Where if you just put him into the hot water, he'd hop right out. We're the frog in the boiling water. We just don't realize it.
Yeah, you're right. Oh boy, yeah. That's a good.
I know that was a lot, huh?
Yeah, I'm thinking now. I think I'm never going to have frog's legs again at the local French restaurant here. So I think you turned me off from there. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, so great analogy, and I'm glad you brought up about the stock buyback issues. And this is something that I've talked about on my program before. I've written about this. The issue is not capitalism versus socialism in this case. And yes, there is definitely socialism is gaining more and more adherence of the young people, our generation and younger. Putting that aside, there are really two types of capitalism that used to exist in my lifetime, and I'm 49 years old. There was this sort of stakeholder capitalism that was the product of the New Deal, the Eisenhower era, parts of the progressive era, as well as something called the American School of Political Economy, which was kind of a healthy economic nationalism. It's where the role of the company had numerous stakeholders that they should serve, that was considered socially acceptable, that was more or less in varying periods of our history upheld by our banking, trade, immigration, and labor policies in various levels. And unfortunately, that got unraveled really starting under the last 2 years of the Carter administration, and really was put on steroids from Reagan onwards, where the company no longer served different stakeholders. You had economists such as Theodore Levitt, Michael Jensen, and Milton Friedman. You had a lot of your supply-siders that entered the Reagan administration and populated, the federal government in varying degrees for a long time afterwards, to this present day in some ways. And one of the things they instituted was the legalization of stock buybacks, which were made illegal during the New Deal. Why? Because it helped contribute to the very unstable, speculative binge of the 1920s. You had deregulation pursued the wrong way in the 1920s, and that again started to take place in the end of the Carter administration and in the Reagan administration. And the company became all about enhancing shareholder value, period. Now, I'm a shareholder in stocks. I have a, for somebody my age, I'm fortunate to have money in the stock market, and that was given to me at birth. Maybe that's too much information for you in the audience. And I'm all for enhancing shareholder value. But the problem is that usually translates into enhancing majority shareholder value. I'm not telling you this, and you know this, I'm telling the audience this because they need to know this information, and probably many know this, but others may not know this. So what had happened is that has taken a toll when when the company's board of directors, CEO engage in stock or share buybacks on a gargantuan level. What happens is that all that profit, and profit is the lifeblood of a free economy, is taken out of giving workers good pensions, higher pay, more R&D, et cetera, et cetera. You know the drill. Now, I know putting workers first has addressed some of these issues of stock buybacks. Do you want to talk about some of the work and some of the positions of putting workers first concerning tax policy and share buybacks, et cetera?
Sure. For the stock buybacks, for me, it's just straight up insider trading.
Mhm.
And there's just the inmates are running the asylum, right? It's the foxes in charge of the hen house. I can control where my stock prices are up, and I'm incentivized, especially when they're compensated so much by stock right now. I'm incentivized to pump up that stock price as much as I can, because then it inflates my net worth. And until 1982, they were illegal because of that. And if you start to look at income inequality levels and where things started to really diverge, where productivity no longer kept up with pay, where the 1% and even like the 0.1% started to severely branch away from working Americans, it's right around that time. And to me, it has a lot to do with some of the decisions made by the Reagan administration. That's one of them right there. I believe that they came to people and they told them, what was the line? The scariest words you can hear is that I'm here I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And Nevin, I think that's bullshit. I think the government can 100% help people. I think we're a government made up of people, by the people, for the people, and governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's up to us to regulate ourselves. But when there's this deluge of money that's coming in, that's now determined to be speech from the Citizens United ruling in 2010, it makes it really hard to have a level playing field, which is also why I go back to unions being important, because they're the ones that can push back against that, because they're the ones that feel the impact the hardest. When these corporations are lobbying for things, it's the workers that are getting hit by it. All that dark money is never being spent to help workers. Not a dime of dark money has ever been spent. None of those gifts that were given to these Supreme Court justices was done to try to help workers. It was all done to try to suppress wages so that these people at the top could have more and more. And I think if you look back to where that started, you can draw a big old circle around that Reagan administration.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you reinforced that point. It's really unfortunate how that has turned out. And that was one of probably the biggest and most serious areas. And you correctly state about the government issue. Yeah, this is one thing I do agree with Senator Elizabeth Warren. She was quoted as saying that it's not a question of how big or small the government is, but who it works for. Because there are cases where you have, quote, big governments throughout history, so to speak, that are absolutely tyrannical. You can't have, and certainly not good for free unions either, when you have a totalitarian state that often is very collectivist to the total disadvantage of any individualism. That crushes unions. You have no checks and balances and whatnot. And unions, by the way, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, has fought against those types of governments. The vast majority of union leaders, Lane Kirkland and George Meany, for example, who are political heroes of mine, amongst many others. But then you also have small government. And what happens with small government, so-called, is you have no checks and balances on the aggregated private sector power. And I'm not talking about mom and pop business private sector power, even national businesses like a nationally owned steel company, for example. I'm talking about like big Wall Street investment firms who have bought out different companies and leverage buyouts, et cetera, large American-based multinational corporations, like, for example, General Motors, as we were talking about. And what happens is they ride roughshod over workers. They ride roughshod over communities and even in investment and trade decisions or promotions against American national security. So when you have a government that is toothless, you're actually in face of private power. That's going to be a problem. I'll give a quick example before we move to the next topic. There was an article in New York Times, I don't know if you recall this, a few years back. It was Sam Polk, who was a hedge fund executive, and he did a tell-all article in the New York Times which discussed his experience as a hedge fund trader slash executive. And he described him and his colleagues, what overtook their minds. They became a fireball of greed. When he started, as he termed it, those were his exact words. And when he was talking about how he was bragging, him and his executives, they would basically have senators eating out of their hands, the mayor of New York, et cetera, like they are almost, the politicians are subordinate to them, is how he described it. And how he described, and he started to have second thoughts about, oh, our investment decisions are hurting the middle class and working class, and even implicitly our national security by doing business with communist China. The executives looked at him like he had four heads, his colleagues, and they were like, well, we don't care. We don't have the time or brain capacity to think about America's workers. And when you look at that, it's not, the issue is to me, you also have to protect your country and have checks and balances against private sector power, because private sector power can be just as suffocating, just as tyrannical, as you will see the documentation of the Amazon warehouses, and Walmart and other companies. And you look at that and say that aggregated private sector oligarch power is just as tyrannical, just as suffocating, and just as un-American as authoritarian, collectivistic, or so-called socialistic governments, whatever you want to call it. So this is why it's not an issue. I'm glad you brought that up, Charles. It's not an issue of the government is always your enemy all the time, every day of the week. And it's not that the government's always your friend every single time, all the time, every day of the week. It's a question of who populates your government, what the value system of the politicians are, and also really politicians that are motivated by doing the right thing by the American people, by our constitutional system of government, and being the fathers and guardians of the nation too as well. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Moving to the next topic, we were talking about the, on our last show, we were talking about the PRO Act, we were talking about the removal of the Michigan right to work law that Governor Whitmer and the state legislature recently passed. What is the status of the PRO Act right now in the Senate and the House?
Goodness, I don't think this session they voted on the PRO Act just because it is no longer controlled by the Democrats, right? And the Republicans have been very contrary to the PRO Act. It's nothing that they would ever bring up for a vote. So it had passed the previous two sessions in the House, gone to the Senate. They had done the parliamentary filibuster, which means they couldn't even bring it up for a vote without that 60 vote threshold. They were nowhere near that. So it just died right there. They still talk about it. It's still something that gets pushed, but I just think they're being realists about it, and they know that it has no chance of actually getting passed anywhere. So I believe they've really started to focus more on statewide and trying to win back those states. And when you see what happened in Michigan, and then you see what just happened in Wisconsin with the Supreme Court race over there, where Janet Protasewicz won that seat, that's huge. And then in Ohio, the vote no on issue 1, which had to do with them trying to set a 60% threshold just for ballot initiatives, that got voted down as well. So I think that there's been a lot of grassroots efforts, because Nevin, one of the things that I love right now is the kids that are coming up they're tired of this shit, man. They're tired of working hard every day and ending up with nothing. I got a 23-year-old and he's trying to figure out where he's going to live, and the rent that they're looking to pay is ridiculous. The everything is so expensive right now. The wages haven't kept up with it, and they're starting to realize, why is it so bad for me? But then I look at the haves, and it's no longer like the have-nots versus the haves. Now it's like the have-nots versus the have-yachts. There's so much separation, and I love talking with you because we get into what I think is the core problem, where we might not have kings and queens in this country, but tell me how Elon Musk and the Walton family and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, tell me how those aren't kings and queens and oligarchs of our time. And they've siphoned off and they've sucked up all this wealth, and they've exploited a system where they have these legal monopolies. We haven't had a monopoly busted up in goodness. It's like Ma Bell, right? So tell me, because the Sherman Antitrust Act is over 100 years old and it's been used throughout history, both good and bad, but it was used, but it's no longer used because they figured out ways to get around the language. They litigated their way to legal monopolies, and it's bad for workers and it's bad for the country too, because it makes everything so much more expensive. It eliminated all those mom and pop shops. They shut them down. You can't just go to the store now and buy groceries that were grown on some farm somewhere. Now there's all kinds of regulations and rules that they've set up in regards to what is and isn't potable for people. And I'm not against regulations, but I am against regulations when they've been lobbied for corporations with the intent of harming the little guy. We should never be for something that's pushing someone else up by holding other people down.
Right, exactly. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that was an excellent summation of what's going on. And I would add that, again, going back to history with President Reagan, and he, on a lot of domestic economic issues, his administration made grievous errors. And I would say they did that as a matter of ideology and perhaps also other considerations. And the issue with that is that starting under Reagan, they halted in about 1982, 1983, the enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act. They believed that, and this was also backed up by the legal doctrine on monopolies and antitrust by former Robert Bork, who's written extensively about this, where as long as the monopoly was supposedly not harming the public interest and keeping the consumer prices low, then we want to encourage mergers and acquisitions. We want to encourage that because it makes companies more effective. That's again, I'm telling the audience this and supplementing you, because there's many people that may not know this because they don't hear this in the news, every night on TV. So really, that's where the decline in the monopolization of the American economy started once again. And yeah, it harmed a lot of small town businesses and enterprises. I mean, look, there are some large enterprises that do good for their employees. Costco, for example, is one such case. So it's not like we're against big business because they're just big and they're all bad because they're big. That's not necessarily the case. And what I find is, I don't mean to sidetrack here. I find that many economists, particularly free market economists, and sure ones that are just militantly anti-capitalist on the other extreme, they lack nuance. And when you look at the economy from the perspective of a history background, and that's my academic background as a history and political science major, and I've taken econ classes too, I find that something as delicate and intricately connected as the economy requires a very nuanced approach, not a one-size-fits-all theory. I think it's time to, I don't want to say throw out the textbooks, but I was listening to one roundtable debate on Firing Line, I think it was called, with William F. Buckley Jr., and he had a guy that was an economist that was pro-tariff and one that was anti-tariff to some degree. And this economics professor, he said that when he was confronted with the reality of how business and industry and trade and unions and whatnot operated, you have to unlearn economics. You have to unlearn the classical, total, undiluted free market economics in order to understand actually how the world works. And yeah, this is what's happened with it was the quote free market at all costs type of economists and columnists that said stock buybacks are good, free trade with Russia and China is good, Gorbachev is reforming, financial deregulation across the board is wonderful. Mergers and acquisitions are going to is the path to true free enterprise and prosperity and lower consumer prices. But in many cases, they're wrong. Now, we agree with the general outlines of the free market economists. Private property is excellent. I think it's not perfect. Capitalism is excellent out of all the other bad economic systems, but capitalism is like a sports game. You need to have referees and rules. Otherwise, everybody's going to get totally clobbered and injured on the field, and you get broken skulls and everything else. Or it's like a tool. A screwdriver is good for fixing things and producing things, right? A screwdriver is also good for using as a weapon too as well. So capitalism is a great tool. It's the best tool out there. But like anything, it's also the practitioners of capitalism that can muck it up and distort it, as well as also the fact that we don't have certain specific rules to prohibit behaviors that help create recessions, depressions. It harnesses the fireball of greed, which is not this rational thing. Fireball of greed is not rational. That's not rational thought, because you don't care who you're hurting in the process, including the country's national security. So I agree with you on that. I think, again, you bring up good points. Sorry about my monologue, but this is an issue I feel very passionate about. But I'm glad one of the things I was reaching about trying to get from you was the activism for the PRO Act is still continuing. I know both houses in the hands of the Republican majority, Senate is still barely in the Democratic majority. Moving onwards to your home state of Michigan. Number one, I know you touched upon the UAW. What's going on with the UAW. How is that being received by the grassroots in other unions, including CWA, as well as just voters, Democrats, Republicans, independents that you speak to in Michigan?
So we had the Labor Day parade in Detroit. It was the first time in 3 years that it got shut down for COVID. And Nevin, there were so many people out there marching, so many different unions. They had all kinds of speakers there. They had senators, members of Congress, state representatives, all there. A lot of positive energy that was there because over a decade ago, when Right to Work got passed in Michigan, it was passed in a lame duck session. There were no hearings on it. It got pushed through in the middle of the night, and it got thrust upon us, even though we were told that it wasn't even on the table during the election cycle. So it was some dirty pool that happened. But instead of just giving up for a solid 10 years, there was just concerted, united union activity, everyone rowing in the same direction to figure out how we can best approach this. And the first thing that we needed to do was get fair maps. The gerrymandering that's happened in our country, it's just absolutely disgusting because its roots are in just some really nasty, racially motivated things that was all about making sure people of color didn't have the voice and representation that they should have. And it still goes on today. If you look at some of the lines that are drawn in other states, like these people should be ashamed of themselves. So the first thing we did is we got fair maps in Michigan. And then after we did that, we had an opportunity to actually win elections because it was no longer deemed that, now we've got these people that vote in this section all grouped up over here, and we can create 4 other districts all around them. And now we have 4 times as much representation, even though we have the exact same number of people, which is just dirty. And if you gotta cheat that way to win, maybe you should take a look at your party and what you're representing and the things that you're pushing forward. You know what? Maybe you should do some pivoting on your own. So once we got the fair maps, we were able to flip the House, the Senate, and the governorships the first time in 40 plus years that we were able to have that. And then it didn't turn into hemming and hawing, because sometimes Democrats, man, they can be their own worst enemy, man. You get 10 Democrats in a room and they can't agree on shit. So they were actually willing to push through because they knew that it was the grassroots union worker driven representation that they had that was pushing them to win those seats. So they fulfilled those promises that they made, because they're supposed to be there representing their constituents, not corporations that are donating money to them. And that's how they were able to repeal right to work. Michigan's the first state in 58 years to do so. And I'm just hopeful that it continues on into states like Wisconsin and Indiana and just all the others. I mean, there's so many, goodness, I think like half the states out there have right to work. And if you look at states with the highest poverty levels, they're right to work states. If you look at states with the lowest wages, they're right to work states. If you look at states with have the highest levels of infant mortality, they're right to work states. I'm a pragmatist, Nevin. I'm totally pragmatic. If all these right to work states were doing great and the people there were living high on the hog and the workers were making money and they were buying, boats and all that stuff, hey man, who am I to argue with that? But when that's not happening, like, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You got to look at what's going on with the numbers, and I'm a numbers guy, and it just doesn't work. Right to work doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. And it also doesn't retain American industry either. In a conversation with an individual I had recently, we were having a debate, very friendly debate about unions. And, he was talking of, and I was mentioning one of the myths that stated that, it was the unions that priced the American industry, steel and automobiles, for example, out of the country, to the point grounding them to be uncompetitive. Well, there were many different reasons for that. It wasn't unions that actually did that, because if we had unions that were relatively toothless, then the South would be booming with industry. Now, are there industries in the South? Yes, there's no question about it. But there's always lower wages and currency devaluations in other countries. To take textile industries. In the South, the textile industries fled from the unionized New England states. They fled to the South after World War II, which was mostly ununionized. There were pockets of union activity and activism in the South, to be sure. But these textile industries and other factories, many of them moved abroad to, let's take Mexico, which starting in the early 1980s engaged in currency devaluations that devalued the peso, making Mexico more attractive to invest for American companies. The runaway, you used to call them runaway plants in the 1940s and 1950s. Then they were termed maquiladoras in Mexico. And they also had the very low wages compared to even right to work states. So you had what the scholar and observer Alan Tonelson, formerly of the U.S. Business and Industry Council, called the race to the bottom. So right to work is really not a solution to retain American industry, because there's always a place with lower wages and also all kinds of governmental manipulations, whether in Mexico or China. China is given free infrastructure improvements, for example. It's one of the reasons why Apple Computer and Electronics moved to China years and years ago. China gave them discounted energy, free land, a very stable labor force under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party, etc. It's not some operation of laissez-faire economics. It's the furthest thing from it. It's just laissez-faire free passes for corporate America, essentially. Right to work also had, as we've talked about on previous shows, I've talked about it on Labor Vision. For those in the audience that's not aware of it, right to work had a very bad history with the Christian Economic Association of the publicist and business person Vance Muse. There's only two things I agree with Vance Muse on. He supported tariffs on imported goods, and he opposed communism. That's where it ends with me, at least. He was a virulent racist. He hated Jews. He was basically the Klan with the suit. And he was very concerned about multiracial labor organizing in the South. And what had happened was to address those concerns, he, along with his successors, pushed right to work laws, which took root in the South. And then in recent the past decade also crept into more and more northern states too as well, unfortunately. Although Michigan recently repealed it, hopefully Wisconsin will repeal their right to work too as well. So yeah, keeping fingers crossed. So right to work has a very bad history. And I think there are people out there that probably believe in right to work, that, they're free to choose whether they belong to a union or not, that very understandable libertarian choice position. They might not be aware of the dark roots of right to work. Just like, and I'm addressing my right-wing members of my audience here when I say this, just like the Communist Party will use things like civil rights, women's rights, legitimate grievances to mask a hidden agenda even to this day of more of a totalitarian state, or the right to work crowd will also mask a very unpopular agenda to do so. And there were actually memos from the Koch Political Network that I recently saw quotations from, where they actually use subterfuge and deceit to say that, look, we got to portray this sort of corporate harness so-called libertarian movement more as kind of a mom and pop grassroots operation. We have to hide who's really behind it. And to me, it just mimics what anti-communists like myself complain about the Communist Party USA, even some of the white nationalist or white supremacist groups. They'll mask themselves as conservatives, even though they're national socialist or destructive populists. They mask an unpopular agenda in order to gain more support. And once they have that support, they have their unpopular agenda. It's not always easy to get rid of. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the right to work, because I wanted to really plug that important historical information there for the audience, hopefully, that you'll share this video with, as well as my audience who might not be aware of that. Now, getting on to the two-tiered, continuing with the UAW, there are concerns about this very unfair two-tiered wage system, where the older UAW workers would get, the higher wages, and then the incoming newer workers, they are paid at a much, much lower rate. Is anything being done to address that? Because that's like pitting workers against each other. That's really distasteful. What say you about that? What's going on?
Great question. Great question, and you're so right. And at the Labor Day parade, the messaging that I saw the most was ending the tiered system, ending the two-tiered system. Because you're right, you'll have a worker over here making X and a worker over here making Y, doing the exact same job. It's not that this one has certain roles and tasks and responsibilities that are different, just completely the same, but paid differently. And that creates acrimony in the work group, and it's done with intent, because all you need to do in a right to work state is to get someone mad about something, bad about anything, and they can drop out. They're no longer paying union dues. They still have to be supported by the union. That costs the union money, that harms them. Eventually unions fold. It's all done with intent. Where the corporations were able to do this, and this isn't just auto workers, right? This is all of them. What they'll do is they'll come to the union, because usually it's in a place where you have to bargain with the union, and you'll say, we want to do X, Y, or Z, and either we can do this, or we're going to offshore that work and send it somewhere else, or we're going to give it to someone else. So like the UAW isn't my area of expertise. I know a lot about call centers, and in a call center world, they'll have these jobs that are a certain way, and then they'll have jobs that are different. Like they'll have jobs that pay 100% a certain rate, and then they'll have leverage titles where they pay 60% and then 40% are by commission. So they'll go to those areas and they'll say, we want to bring in this leverage title. And the union will say, no way, there's no way we're going to have someone working next to someone that makes a different amount. And then the company says, okay, well, now we're going to go over to this other union, or we're going to go over to this other state, and we're going to offer it to them there instead. And you know what? We're going to shut down your location as well and just build them over there. And then they have to say, oh, shit, well, what are my choices here? I'm eating a shit sandwich, or I'm eating half a shit sandwich. And sometimes that's the best choice that you have. And that's where you get these two-tiered systems. It was them trying to agree to something to be as beneficial as they could, given the circumstances. Because again, man, we're not in some perfect world. Sometimes you're making hard decisions. And they did it with the best of intentions, where they wanted to get their foot in the door, because it's better to get them in union and then start to up their trajectory and work them towards where the other people are, than having them locked out completely. That doesn't help in any way. But there's also some complacency that goes on with unions, where they bring them in and they're a minority of the work group, right? They're 20% of the work group and 80% is over here. And unions aren't perfect. And sometimes, as long as you can keep the majority happy, these people over here suffer. But one of the tenets of being union is an injury to one is an injury to all. So those 20% of those people over there are just as important as the 80% over here. So I'm glad that the UAW is addressing this. I think it's something that needs to be done across industries. But Nevin, one of the most important things that I think needs to be done to fix this is fixing our tax laws in regards to how corporations are able to offshore, outsource our work, get huge tax breaks for doing it. You should be incentivized for doing business in the United States with American workers. And you should be de-incentivized from sending those jobs offshore, because they send them to countries where they have horrible labor records, they have horrible climate records, they go over there, they wreck places. Bangladesh, Rana Plaza, over 1,000 garment workers dead when the building collapsed. The tanneries where they're just pumping chemicals into the water over there, just laying waste to landscapes. You go over to the South Pacific, where labor activists are getting stabbed to death over there. They're red tagging them, where they try to scare folks saying that labor unions are going to bring communism to all these places, and they're killing people, Nevin. And like morality doesn't stop at the end of our shores, and we have a responsibility to other nations as the United States to lift those countries up with us, right? Like the JFK said, a high tide lifts all ships. And nowadays it's turned into the high tide just lifts the yachts. And I can't think of anything worse than being a person that knowingly harms other people just to make my life better.
Yeah, no, I don't like you, as we've talked about before. I don't like powerful bullying the weak on a constant basis. That's always been a turnoff, whether it comes from a overly centralized government or all-powerful private sector oligarchs. I don't like either. I think the role of the state in part is to have those exercise policies that result in better checks and balances. Now, wish list of policies, because we're going to the top of the hour to when we have to end the show. So you mentioned reforming our tax policies, which means really going back to the Reagan era and incentivizing the right kind of business activity away from too much short-term financial gain. Doesn't mean we're getting rid of Wall Street or private banking or anything. We're not advocating that, but re-incentivizing the economy more towards investment and production rather than short-term financial gain. So we've talked about the tax policies. We talked about, you definitely have hinted at what your trade policy would be too as well when addressing tax policy. What are some other things you peppered parts of your discussion with some of these things? Summarize your top 5 policies in your wish list. If you were basically had president for life for a day, dictator for a day, to quote Nick Hanauer on the Pitchfork Economics podcast. Not that you and I advocate dictatorship, we're firm opponents of dictatorship, but if you had the right to basically do whatever you want in the United States for a day, what are your top 5 policies that you would enact?
In no particular order, right to work would be gone. If someone wants to decertify a union, all they need is 50.01% of a vote, and it's gone. Right to work doesn't work. It's wrong for workers. They need to abolish Citizens United. Dark money is never being used to help the people. It's always there to benefit those that already have the most, and that doesn't work for me. Number 3, federal contracts shouldn't go to companies that are eliminating jobs here in the United States. You should incentivize entrepreneurship here that hires workers inside of our country. And when the United States is strong, it helps us help other people as well. Just like when that mask drops down on the airplane and they tell you, put your mask on first before you help someone else. We got to make sure that we're strong here so that we can help others. And to go along with that, the tax laws, we need to make sure that we're not exploiting those other countries. choice, right? We've done a lot of harm in this world where our actions here has led to true suffering in other places. And we need to own that, we need to acknowledge it. And I think that there's this hesitancy right now to take any kind of criticism amongst some people, that you can't say anything bad. I'm not privileged in any way. You can't tell me that this negative history over here should be told to these people. Like, no, you have to, to know all is to forgive all. So you have to start understanding what happened so that you can make tomorrow a better place. Like there's two, and I guess my last one, like the philosophy of it is like the superhero and the supervillain both have the same origin. Something bad happened to me when I was young, and one person chose to, I'm never going to let that happen to someone else again. And one person chose, I'm going to make sure everyone else suffers the same way that I did. And we got to make sure that we're pushing people to be this. Just because your life was hard and that you learned from it doesn't mean that other people should suffer for that as well. And I'm not saying that hardship doesn't build character. I'm saying that you shouldn't force something bad on something. We should always be trying to make tomorrow a brighter future for the kids coming up, because they deserve it. We can do better. And when we all do better, we all do better.
No, I couldn't have said it more. I have a term for that last point, because I agree with you. You have to struggle and you have to work. You can't just have everything handed to you. Hard work is vital for that. But my term for it, like anything else, needs to be a balance. I call it shared but earned prosperity. That's what I term it. It has to be shared. I'm not even saying equally, but enough where people, the average Joe Schmo, can afford basic goods and services, and could also pump money in the economy, like going on vacations, buying a home, buying a car, investing part of their salary in pensions, whether defined benefit, more traditional, or 401ks and whatnot, having a savings account, et cetera, because that builds the capitalist economy. And that's my kind of point of view there that I like to try to argue with more conservative leaning viewers in the audience. So it's perfect. It has to be shared, but it has to be earned. Just because we can't achieve a utopia, which is impossible, is not a valid excuse for not struggling for a better country, a better economy, and a stronger America. Any other closing comments? And also, where can people find more information on putting workers first? And older podcasts, or the Labor Vision, and anything else you have to share.
Yeah, just thank you. Thank you for all of your activism and what you're doing to help people out. It's always a pleasure getting a chance to talk with you. I'm going to have to go break out my dictionary and look up some of the words that you used today. I'm always trying to keep up with your vernacular, but you can find us mostly on Facebook with Putting Workers First, although we're looking to get our website revamped, because we recently did a rebrand on some of our images and stuff. So we're updating that. But Facebook, if you search for Putting Workers First, you'll find us. Same with the Labor Vision podcast. You can find us there. And then I did have a TikTok with Union Strong Activists for a while, but that sort of fell off. But yeah, just as long as you're out there supporting labor, you're supporting me.
Right. And the more you're educating, that's the important thing. Educating people that, might not be aware of labor history, or really the strengths of unions and what well-led unions do for average people and the economy as a whole is very important. You have a lot of good memes, I've noticed, on Putting Workers First Facebook page, so feel free to like that if that's your lane you like to drive ideologically in, if you're pro-union or if you're open-minded. Thank you, Charles. Again, I've learned a lot from you. As always an informative guest. I wish there was definitely some more questions I wanted to ask, but we could always save that for another show. I'm always learning, and I appreciate the praise you gave me. That's very, very kind. Great guests as always, a lot of great information. Feel free to like Putting Workers First on Facebook. And thanks again, Charles. And
it's
everyone in the audience, have a great rest of your weekend. God bless. Let's all pray and hope for a better United States of America. Be safe. God bless. Take care.